Welcome to today's webinar on measuring the impact of your outcomes-based project hosted by the Go Lab. Thank you so much everyone for joining us. Before I introduce our sparkling panel this morning, I just wanted to say a little bit about the Government Outcomes Lab and introduce you to the topic. So we're a team based at the University of Oxford. We're a joint project, a partnership between the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford and UK central government. And we're a team of academic researchers, but also practitioners, practitioners on a mission to improve the provision of public services to better tackle complex social issues. And we have a particular focus on outcome-based models. So things like social impact bonds have been a real area of focus for us since we were established in 2016. So that's us, the team. We have a range of resources available for those who are interested in exploring outcomes-based approaches to configuring public services. So we have a lot of material on our website. We also host events, have a network of pioneering practitioners and some fellows of practice who are eyes and ears on the ground in terms of what's going on and the latest thinking around these approaches. I also just wanted to flag a couple of particularly helpful resources for those of you who are thinking about evaluation in the context of an outcomes-based approach. So we have some technical guides which set out in detail particular aspects that you might want to bear in mind within a social impact bond or outcomes-based project. If you'd like some one-on-one time with a member of the team, you can book an advice surgery through our website and we'll gear our conversation to any particular concerns that you have. And we also have a publications library, which is our kind of curated set of resources that we think might be relevant to you working in this space. So, today's speakers, I'm really thrilled. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Chi-Hung Sin. Chi-Hung is Director of Social Innovation and Social Investment at Traverse, a consultancy. So you have a breadth of experience in supporting commissioners to design and develop social impact bonds and including their thinking around evaluations. And you've worked with a number of different local authorities, I understand, providers and also service users across this space in the health, social care and education sector. Thank you for joining us, Chi-Hung. I also am joined by Mark Tuckett. Mark is Assistant Director of Public Service Reform at Sheffield City Council, a post he has held for the past 2 years. And prior to this, Mark also worked in other roles at Sheffield City Council, focusing on improving policy and performance. And Mark has also held a role in the voluntary sector as Head of Impact at CanFed, an international NGO. And Claire Fitzgerald is a research fellow and colleague at the Government Outcomes Lab. Claire completed her PhD in public administration from North Carolina State University in 2016. And Claire's research focuses on performance measurement and management, the way that information is used in decision-making and innovative projects. At the Go Lab, Claire's research focuses on evaluations of social impact bonds and outcome-based contracts, and we often draw on Claire's expertise to give practical guidance to decision makers in this space. And just a little bit about who else is joining us this morning on the web. So we have a really diverse audience, mostly from the UK, but actually with quite an international presence as well. We've got colleagues joining us from South Africa, the US, Italy, India, Finland, Portugal. So thank you for joining us, everyone. Also people from a range of roles. So we have commissioners, policy managers, directors of projects, some people coming in from the evaluation side, some evaluation specialists. So thank you everyone for joining us. I just wanted to mention that as a team, the Government Outcomes Lab really comes from the commissioner perspective. We're coming from the perspective of the public sector in terms of the lens that we take on some of this stuff. And we've also received some questions in advance of the session. Thank you so much for sharing these with us. We've really used these to try and structure the session, so hopefully we'll come to some of these questions today, particularly thinking about appropriate evaluation design, a relevant focus for evaluation work, how can we measure impact, when is it cost effective to think about these evaluation questions. So hopefully we'll be turning to a number of these questions across the session. But again, if there is anything in particular that you feel that we haven't turned to in sufficient detail and that's relevant for your project, please do feel able to book an advice surgery with a member of the team online afterwards. Great. So in terms of the structure of the session, we sort of have three areas of focus across the webinar this morning. So we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about why we ought to be engaging with evaluation work in relation to these outcome-based projects. What is an evaluation? We'll also be moving into thinking about evaluation scope and focus. What are you evaluating, and developing an evaluation strategy. And finally, we'll be focusing on some practical considerations. So thinking about how you might want to go on to set up an evaluation project in relation to your social impact bond, perhaps. Andrea reminds me that throughout the course of the session, we can take questions using the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So please do feel free to submit questions throughout the session, and there are structured points throughout our conversation where we'll hope to take questions from the live audience. Great. So let's kick off then with a little bit of context around evaluation. What are we talking about here? Why might we think it's important? And so from my perspective, speaking with people who are working in the field of outcomes-based commissioning, everyone's very passionate and very fired up about making positive change, improving the lives of people and their communities. And evaluation really is one tool that we might use to ensure that we're achieving that and really get a good sense of how best to achieve our objectives and our goals in this space, really ensuring that we're delivering the best quality programs and services for people and communities that matter. So perhaps I could pass to Claire for a little bit of context around what we mean by evaluation. It's quite a broad term. It encompasses quite a range of approaches and types of evaluation. So Claire, I was wondering if you could provide a sort of a quick overview by what we mean by evaluation and some of the different types of evaluation that might be relevant for social impact bonds.
Sure. So I suppose largely speaking, evaluation is kind of the application of social science tools to really understand the effectiveness or the degree to which a particular program or intervention is both rolled out the way we think it should be, and also whether or not it's effective, sort of in a backward-looking sense. And so when we think through the various kinds of the purpose of evaluation, we usually think about them in two camps, right? There's the formative side of evaluation, which is very much about trying to improve different interventions, different policies, different services. And as it suggests here, it's designed, done, and intended to support the process of improvement, of implementation. And it's normally commissioned or done by and delivered to someone who can make these improvements. So this is very much around sort of the domain of public managers, of commissioners, right? Folks who have oversight and managerial say in how things are done. We then also have summative evaluation, right? And this is kind of the evaluation which is meant to prove that something is effective. You want to make a claim that the activities that you've aligned and put together have actually accomplished what you thought they would. And so this is done for or by observers or decision makers, by contrast with those who implement, who need evaluative conclusions for any reasons besides development. So this is about massively expanding a particular service, cutting a service, trying to figure out which one is more effective than another. These are sort of maybe those very high-level policy decisions, as opposed to the day-to-day decision-making that is done on a local context. I mean, I can keep going, or we can pass it back over.
No,
to
I think that's really helpful. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to briefly introduce is a really strong and prevalent concept when it comes to evaluation, which is the idea of a theory of change. Could you link that perhaps to some of your thinking around this distinction between formative to improve, and then on the other hand, this summative piece to prove?
Sure. So, developing a theory of change, what we might also call a logic model or a chain of cause and effect, is a tool that's used to sort of organize thinking around the allocation of resources, be they human, financial, any number of other things, and how those are mobilized through activities to actually generate outputs and outcomes, right? So it's not necessarily supposed to be a representation of reality. It's a heuristic, right? It's something to help us organize very complex thoughts. So often you'll put together a theory of change in terms of what your intervention is supposed to accomplish, right? So we hire therapists to then deliver therapy to a cohort that is supposed to improve potentially health outcomes, and then in the long term improve overall well-being and population level kinds of things. And so in this theory of change, as we map out each thing that is supposed to link to the next, you can kind of begin cutting that theory of change and assigning different forms of evaluation around it, right? So formative evaluation is very much around those inputs, activities, and maybe those early term outputs, right? That's really where that formative evaluation is iterating to understand whether or not we're mobilizing resources the way we thought we would, and if that is generating short-term outputs. The summative evaluation is perhaps looking overall over the entire theory of change to try to understand if all of those arrows, all of those causal links are indeed holding together the way we think they would.
Brilliant, thank you, Claire. And I wondered if you could provide perhaps a little bit more information around the different approaches to evaluation. You mentioned that we might be looking at slightly different things depending on which part of the theory of change we're focusing on. Could you talk a little bit about those different methods or approaches?
Sure. So, you know, we've got a table that outlines some of this, and I suppose one way to think through it is that your formative evaluation is towards the top of the table, and the things that would be summative evaluation are towards the bottom of this, right? So we have this notion of monitoring, right? And this is probably where folks might get a little iffy, right? This is where administrative burden and data capture and all of those kinds of things can potentially raise folks' hackles. But monitoring is this idea that you have a rapid feedback around whether or not the implementation is progressing as planned. And this is effectively that kind of quick-fire dashboarding. Maybe some of it is internal and informal reporting. And it's just that continual check-in to see if things are ticking forward. In a more formalized way, this can become a performance management routine or a performance management system. And this is about tying explicit goals to that ongoing monitoring process. Process evaluation is then perhaps something that's done by an external organization often. And this is around sort of looking backwards, perhaps over a longer time horizon, and getting that outside opinion around whether or not things have progressed the way that they should, and if the implementation phase is functioning. So examples of process evaluations in the social impact bond space, Chi-Hung has actually done some process evaluation on the S6 SIB. I'm sure he can talk more about that. We also see the example from Birmingham and an evaluation around a step-down program there. Outcomes evaluation is perhaps a post hoc, right? It's a form of summative evaluation. It's not necessarily a measure of impact, but it is a way of accounting for the various outcomes that a particular project has generated. And so an example, I suppose, from SIBs would be the DWP Innovation Fund information sheets that they used to put out. So they would put a tally of all of the various things that those projects have accomplished. The big impact evaluation that we see in the social impact bond space, an impact evaluation explicitly is whether or not a policy produced intended effects compared to what would have happened in the absence of that particular intervention, something that economists will often call having a counterfactual and an estimate of dead rate. And in the UK, the Peterborough impact evaluation is probably the one we would point to as best example, and giving us a real estimate of impact in terms of what that intervention and that SIB project actually accomplished. And then I think sort of most largely, once you've gotten sort of the information from formative evaluation and summative evaluation, and you have the whole suite of the theory of change, causal links represented, you can move to a pretty rigorous cost benefit or value for money estimate. So you take all of the various things that you've been able to evidence through data, and you monetize them, right? And you try to make explicit what the cost of a particular project was vis-a-vis the benefits that it's generated. And so it's that side of things, and then also perhaps a big post hoc understanding of key mechanisms, looking back and making sense of the whole process and how it links to both this economic, monetization aspect of it, as well as the impact itself. So that's kind of generally the types of different evaluations that we see. And the key questions, which would be the evaluation questions, that if you're asking that, that's probably the type of evaluation you'd be looking at.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Claire. No easy feat covering all of that content, so thank you. I found it particularly helpful the way that you tease out the definition of impact evaluation, and I think that's something that we find a lot in this space, is that impact as a term is used quite flexibly. For some people that has a very specific implication in terms of the type of method that you're looking at. So for people perhaps more embedded within the evaluation space, it brings to mind a really robust quantitative study with a clearly defined treatment and comparator group, and the impact is then the attributable or the causal difference that a particular program has made. But that actually in this space, other people use impact perhaps a bit more loosely to give a broader sense of whether the program has been tracking as intended, and a sort of a looser sense. So I think that's really helpful that we ourselves are kind of clear on some of the differences in terms of how these terms are used. And I suppose there's another tricky thing in this space, I think, maybe an elephant in the room when it comes to outcomes-based commissioning, which is if outcomes-based projects are all about paying for success or paying for impact, why might a government commissioner actually also be interested in having an evaluation or having specifically an impact evaluation? This relates to some of the questions we had in advance of the session.
Yeah, so I think, the idea within a social impact bond is that you could build in this robust estimate of impact, right? So we're talking about impact in perhaps its most rigorous sense. And it's through that you would evidence the outcomes that you're willing to pay for, right? So this is a mechanism or a tool for a commissioner to know that they're not paying for outcomes that would have happened without the intervention. It's allowing them to really allocate resources to the things that their particular project has delivered. And so there's not funding going towards outcomes that are nebulous or perhaps of less value because they're not necessarily causal or additional to what would have happened anyway. And so I think that the interesting thing here in a PBR or a SIB project is that the outcomes that are paid for, you can pay on the back of an actual evaluation, right? You don't necessarily need to just lay out a rate card. You can build it into the payment mechanism itself.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's one of the real points of contrast between the US and the UK experience around social impact bonds is so much more frequently in the US and other international examples, we see payment mechanisms that are very much structured around a very formal and robust quantitative impact evaluation. But in the UK, a number of SIBs actually make payments for shorter term outputs or sort of near-term outcome type measures that are evidenced just on the basis of data production rather than a very formalized impact evaluation. Okay, great, thank you. A few questions have come through on the chat. In part, this is because of my forgetfulness to mention that the slides are available to download online and will also be available after the session. Indeed, the session itself will be available on YouTube to watch and share afterwards. Another couple of questions that have come in particularly around the examples that Claire gave, and we'll be able to add that additional information into the slides afterwards to make sure that we've got a refreshed slide pack that has all of that detail in it. Great. Now I'd love to turn to Mark to ask a little bit about your sort of local government experience in relation to evaluation. So could you talk about how evaluation is used within local government? Is it seen as important?
I can't speak for all of local government.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not putting it all on you.
I can speak for Sheffield City Council where I work. And so the straight answer to this question, is evaluation seen as important? Absolutely, yes it is. If we are thinking about introducing new service models, we want to understand what other places' experience of those service models has been, whether those types of interventions has delivered the sorts of impact that we might be targeting. Or perhaps as we near the end of a programme, we want to understand whether we should adopt it as mainstream service delivery, whether we should adapt it, whether we should scale it up, or in some circumstances for unsuccessful projects, scale them down or stop them. So absolutely it is seen as important. I can talk about some specific evaluation exercises that I've been involved in. So I was involved in Sheffield's Troubled Families programme for UK-based those in the audience from the UK will be familiar with this, but international audiences, 6 or so years ago, efforts to improve the lives of people living in complex circumstances, a nationally run programme, but very much implemented locally. For us, at least as important as the quantitative evaluation was a year-long knowledge transfer exercise that we undertook. We commissioned a research partner, and they worked with us as commissioners to get into some of the knotty questions about cultural attitudes, about service model differences, about relationships between different professional disciplines, and that was hugely informative and directly led to changes in the service model arising from that evaluation. On the more quantitative side, as I lead work to develop a series of new initiatives, and for each of them, outcomes-based approaches or social investment is under close consideration. We are developing the sorts of theories of change that Claire referenced, but it's absolutely key is supplementing that qualitative assessment with numbers, with the quantitative side as well. So what can we predict about the likelihood of effect, the likelihood of success, and can we convince ourselves and decision makers that this is a sensible, viable value for money way of progressing. So yes, it is absolutely seen as important. My answer needs to be complicated slightly, because while there is definitely a demand for evaluation, I think the supply of evaluation and robust high quality evaluation is difficult. So this as a discipline, as a way of thinking about public service delivery is nascent, and so there may be not quite the number of evaluation exercises that one can call upon from other places. It needs to be said as well, it will be hard to understate the financial constraint within which local authorities are operating. And so either creating the headroom in a project budget to pay for this sort of evaluation, or retaining or potentially even growing the sort of in-house capacity to undertake these sorts of the sorts of skills that you need is challenging. So demand, absolutely yes. I think on the supply side, it is more constrained. And there are some instances where a decision needs to be taken quickly, and those timescales don't necessarily marry up with the required timescales for robust evaluation. So yes, but I think is the summary.
Yeah. Okay. Great, thank you, Mark. No, it's really nice to see that there were some examples both of more qualitative, process-orientated evaluation work that have been seen as really valuable, in addition to some of the more numerically led quantitative work. And yeah, we definitely need to appreciate, I think, that there are timelines that matter when it comes to decision making, and we need to, in the space of applied research, always be really sensitive to that, I think, and to some of the other constraints. Your point also about what are we evaluating, I think we'll come to in the next section. I just wanted to ask you for a little bit more around evaluation in relation to your work on outcomes-based approaches. What do you see as the value of evaluation in that context?
We've had a number of conversations over the past, and sort of much of the work that I think the Government Outcomes Lab has put into the public domain has indicated that outcomes-based approaches, social investments, is a model that can work in some but not all circumstances. It feels like the jury's out on social investment, and I think robust evaluation can help the jury come back. And so helping to inform this still developing and a new model of financing public service delivery is really important. And so I am making recommendations to colleagues about whether or not things are value for money, good value for money or not, but the evidence to support that is sometimes partial. So we are putting forward proposals where we think there is the model can work, and we think it's a sensible approach to adopt. But there's still some points of uncertainty that we're keen evaluation type approaches to help us unpick. I think secondly, it's the work that we're doing is helping us understand some of the challenges in availability of information and data, that regardless of whether or not we introduce an outcomes-based approach or not, it's uncovering some interesting challenges and some gaps in knowledge. I think the third and most important point is that the series of projects that I'm developing, for all of them, we're thinking about improving outcomes for people in Sheffield. And we want to know by the end of these whether or not we ought to be changing the mainstream delivery of public services. We can only answer that question if we've designed in evaluation approaches that is going to help us answer those questions at the end. So we need to think about the impact on mainstream services and what we do at the end of this series of projects. And we need to be thinking about that now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. I think that question around legacy and the decisions that you want to be able to take at the end are really important in informing the kind of evaluation that you might want to try and embed and think about upfront and well in advance of commissioning an evaluation or working with in-house teams to develop evaluation materials. Great, thank you. And Chi-Hung, you spend a lot of time advising local government commissioners. It would be great to hear some of your insights about how commissioners are using existing evaluations, if at all. Can you give us a sense of that?
Yeah, sure. I think there's definitely been a shift. So I'm aware that there's some international audiences for this webinar. So I think it's always very important when we talk about outcomes-based projects or SIBs and evaluations to actually contextualize them in, what's the wider situation in any country or locality about the cultures and practice around evidence and outcomes. So here in the UK, we have a long history of evidence-based policy and practice, especially since the early 90s onwards. So definitely by now, with all those decades having gone past, we do on the ground detect what Mark has said earlier, that there's a real demand for evaluation. Having said that, there is variability across different sectors because there are different cultures, different expectations around evidence, quality of evidence, use of evaluation. So for example, when I work with healthcare sector commissioners, the practice and expectations around evaluations are, I think, much more mainstreamed because the whole quality improvement discipline in healthcare in the UK does call for ongoing evaluations. So there are sectoral differences. But by and large, I think for commissioners here, whether it's local authorities, health, education, housing, etc., central or local, they tend to want and use evaluations to do with service design or redesign, commissioning approaches. So how good are different commissioning approaches working? They want to look at the impact and the value of the providers that they're commissioning services out to for delivery. They are wanting to look at the impact on workforce development, because there have been lots of transformations in the UK, at least, around the public service workforce in terms of capacity competency. So there are a range of interventions there. There are also requirements for evaluations around partnerships. So the types of evaluations that commissioners want are also quite varied. So there isn't just one approach or one set of expectations. The one thing I would point out is that while we talk about outcomes and impact, it is still largely so, although things are changing, that what we call outcomes seem to be defined from the system perspective, from the commissioner, the public sector perspective, that is a very valuable perspective. But what I always say to people when you're doing evaluations is always ask the question, outcomes for who? So success from whose perspectives? So what does the commissioner define as an outcome? Is it about better public service expenditure, more effective resource use? What about outcomes from the perspective of professionals? What about outcomes from the perspective of the service beneficiaries? So I always encourage people to actually surface out those different layers of outcomes because they are important. What I've also detected is the point that's made very well by Mark about the financial constraints to local authorities and other commissioners. So while you may have a demand for evaluations and the evidence, there is a question mark about how much do we pay for this? How much does what type of evaluation cost? And I think there have been some questions already posed by audience members about, can you give us some guidance about how do we make a decision about how much to pay for an evaluation? So I think there are both demand and supply side issues. And under those kinds of resource constraints, sometimes people settle for good enough. But then what good enough looks like might not always be very clearly explained. So I've certainly worked with commissioners whose idea of good enough is having good case studies. Another commissioner has told me in the past that we can never, within our budget, look for really robust attributional effects. What we're looking for are compelling stories. Because don't forget, in the context of, say, a local authority, you do have local politicians, elected members, etc., etc. So there isn't just one demand for the evaluation and what comes out of it. There are numerous demands, and sometimes having a compelling story can be sufficient. Mm. And just last but not least, commissioners are also telling me that these days, looking at outcomes and impact, while good, is no longer sufficient because of the financial constraints. People are looking for something else, and that something else is the pound sign. So the value for money narrative, because we can't fund everything that can tell a good outcome story. So that value addedness, the value for money is important. Having said that, working with commissioners, I do sense that while everyone has that demand, not many know how to articulate that demand. And why do I say that? I've seen evaluation briefs for the economic stuff where in the first paragraph, someone says, I want a cost-benefit analysis. Somewhere down the second paragraph, you see cost effectiveness. Then you see return on investment. And basically, it's people just chucking everything in the kitchen sink in, hoping someone would know what to do. When actually, if you're evaluation purist, you know that all those techniques are very different, requiring different evidence, producing different findings.
Great, that's really helpful. Lots to think about in there. So I found it particularly helpful the way you structure out these different tiers or these layers at which you might have evaluation questions. Your question, outcomes for who, I think is something that we should really all take away with. And then those constraints around sort of feasibility in different contexts and different audiences for evaluation. I think perhaps we'll come to in a little bit more detail in the final section around practicalities. Thank you so much. Any tips in terms of supporting government officials to build and enhance a culture of evaluation or learning, perhaps winning over more sceptical stakeholders?
Sure. I think there are a number of things that I would draw on from experience. So one is never assume people understand what you mean when you use the E word, evaluation, because it conjures up different things, especially performance management. And that immediately causes anxieties to rise because people think you're scrutinizing them and wanting to make a pronouncement at the end that reflects on how well they personally have done. So never take it for granted people know exactly what it is you're trying to do. I think that you need to grab the bull by the horns here and do some explicit myth busting. So for example, evaluations are expensive, or evaluations take a very long time. Evaluations only tell you what works after the event and therefore not not very useful. So do some explicit myth bustings. But I also think it's really, really important sometimes for evaluators not to be too precious about the enterprise of evaluation, where, you know, I often advise practitioners that actually if you're working in, say, healthcare in the UK, rather than always talk about everything in evaluation speak and evaluation vocabulary, can you talk about them using the headings that make sense to people who work in that sector? So quality improvement. In the NHS in the UK, we are guided by what's known as the QIP agenda, QIPP, quality, innovation, productivity, prevention. So can you talk about things using those headings? Because it just makes it so much more intuitive for the people that you're trying to influence, that can draw that direct link between evaluation and how it helps them meet strategic priorities. And last but not least, from the practitioner professional viewpoint, you must always convince people that evaluation is not a bolt-on because they think it's a luxury, they think it's an added ask, but actually getting them to see this really is part of good commissioning. When all of us were familiar with the commissioning cycle diagram, evaluation is in there, and people need to see this is just part of routine business as usual. It's not an additional ask.
Great, thank you. Mark, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Only a couple of brief comments. I think there is people on the webinar who are working local authorities contexts and probably other public sector contexts as well will be familiar with sort of standardized forms for decisions, standardized processes. And we've talked as well as alongside things like what are the financial implications, what are the HR implications, what are the legal implications of this decision, sort of a standard expectation to say, what does the evidence say, or what does the best available evidence say about this particular proposal? So I think there are things that you can think about within organisations to sort of adopt and work within the established processes, but to see evaluation in some of those sorts of formalised forms. In the case of the social investment and the Life Chances Fund and other similar initiatives where there's an availability of resource, or an organisation, in this instance central government, putting resource into the programme, setting an assumption, an expectation, a requirement even to undertake evaluation activities, to share and to demonstrate how you've adopted and learned from other places, I think is helpful. So I think there are things that you can do. But
Great. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions come in from the audience, so thank you for those. In fact, one from Sue DeWitt, hello Sue, is a very helpful pivot point in terms of thinking about what are you evaluating. So Sue's question is, how should or have SIB evaluations differed from traditionally contracted evaluations? And for me, I think this raises an important question, which is sort of, how do we formulate the evaluation question in this space? What is it exactly that we're evaluating here? This is one of the things that I think we've tried to articulate in a few different ways as a team. But evaluation, particularly impact evaluation questions, could be potentially focused at the level of the intervention, at the level of the frontline service. What impact is this having in the lives of those using that service, particularly compared to what would have happened anyway? So we've got an appraisal of the effectiveness or the impact of a service. There are also questions going on around the SIB, or the outcomes-based approach, as a commissioning mechanism, which is asking a slightly different question and may not be answered by just running a quantitative impact evaluation to compare the outcomes achieved by those who received the social impact bond service from those who hadn't. So thinking about the Peterborough social impact bond example, there was a very robust quantitative evaluation wrapped around that. And we could see that the outcomes had improved for those receiving the social impact bond service, the one service. Their reoffending rates were reduced compared to a nationally constructed comparator group, But was that because of the social impact bond, or was that because there was very intensive collaborative support from a range of voluntary sector organisations, which could have been paid for on a grant basis, through a pay for activity contract, or through a social impact bond? So to what extent did that only happen because of a social impact bond? I think that's a really tough questions to answer. We definitely don't have all of the answers, or indeed all of the skills so far to really get under the skin of that as a question. But I think it's definitely something to bear in mind when it comes to thinking through what are we evaluating. So we have a slide here, this kind of double trouble, this challenge of potentially being interested in the frontline service and the impact of that at the same time, or perhaps in addition to having this question around the wider commissioning structure. One of the things that I think we're increasingly encouraging commissioners to work through and think about in our engagement is, what's the logic of using an outcomes-based approach for you locally? What is it that you're hoping to have unlocked in terms of change practice or change processes that flows directly from using an outcomes-based approach? So that's sort of a tough one, I suppose, in terms of the tiers of questions that come through that. I could maybe turn to Claire a little bit. Do you have any more thoughts in terms of that challenge around thinking about scope?
Yeah, I mean, I think as was pointed out by Chi-Hung and Mark, right, there's the big question, I suppose, when you think through the scope of your evaluation, or what you hope the evaluation might accomplish, is, to me, it's around what you're trying to learn as a decision maker. So it's not necessarily about pointing fingers or trying to assign blame or be particularly evaluative or scrutinize, as Chi-Hung articulated it. It's about really being clear in terms of what you need to make future decisions based on, and scoping an evaluation that will give you the kind of information that is appropriate to those decisions that you have to make. And so while we think through the benefits of doing particular interventions, or as Elle suggested, the benefits of doing particular interventions within particular commissioning approaches, right? Those are different learning outcomes. Those are different things that you want to learn. And in some, an RCT might be really, really great. But in others, the information that you need is highly qualitative. It's about building bridges between particular folks within your organization. It's about understanding relational dynamics. And you need to take a qualitative approach. So, in terms of scoping, it's a difficult question to help folks arrive at as an external person, because so much of it is predicated upon what their organizational goals are, what their jobs are, and the decisions that they look forward to making. And so it's to me, it's best handled through dialogue. If these are your strategic pitch points in the future, here are the kinds of evaluations we might be able to help you design and execute. And you do that iteratively, right? This isn't necessarily a cold and hard one-time decision. It's a conversation and decision over a bit of time.
Thank you. Mark, what are you thinking of in terms of the scope of any evaluation work that you've got under consideration at the moment? What's sort of the rationale for your upcoming work?
All of the above. There are at least sort of four things that we might want to think about. I think part of the attraction of pursuing a series of outcomes-based approaches is the fact that we're putting outcomes at the heart of new arrangements, and quickly behind outcomes come the information and data to determine whether or not those outcomes are being delivered. So for those projects that we implement, information performance management, to use that strand of the slide that was seen earlier on, is going to be absolutely integral to the delivery of the project itself, because there are financial implications, there are financial flows that will change according to the level of performance of the project. So I think at the first level, there's just the basic implementation of the project itself and the importance of evaluation for that. I think the second point I sort of alluded to earlier, but we're doing these things to determine and to see whether there is a better way of delivering public services. In order to answer that question in 4 or 5 years' time, we need to undertake evaluation in order to answer it. And so we need to know whether this different model of delivering public services is a model that we want to adopt, adapt, or not to take forward and put down as an unsuccessful experiment, if you like. So I think the second point is whether the program itself has delivered in aggregate the improvement in outcomes, both measurable, but perhaps some of the sort of more cultural and qualitative changes that we might be striving to achieve as well. I think the third point is, as you sort of allude to, this of the SIB effect. Is this a sensible way of commissioning public services in itself? And I think we have a duty to understand the value for money and ensuring that public money is being spent sensibly. We know that social investment and outcomes-based contracting brings some additional costs, and we also think that it brings some additional benefits as well, and that greater focus on outcomes, greater focus on information, on data, on sort of forward-looking information data as well as the retrospective is valuable. And adapting delivery informed by some of that information is clearly a valuable thing, something that has got benefit to it. Can we understand what those costs and incremental benefits are of doing something as a social investment, on a social investment arrangement? I think one of the things that we're also trying to do in Sheffield is think about a number of these at once. And are there economies of scale that arise by thinking about not just a single outcomes-based contract, but actually thinking about some of the synergies across multiple outcomes-based approaches? And we think those synergies probably do exist in territories around financial management, information management, evaluation approaches, actually. And so I think there are some economies of scale that can be captured, but the evidence base for that is very, very small. And so I think we'll sort of be finding our way on that last element of it. But a number of different layers and a number of different avenues that we'll be keen to explore.
Great, thank you. It's really helpful to get a sense of how you're framing these different questions locally. Chi-Hung, perhaps I could ask you to reflect on a couple of examples that you've seen of evaluations around outcomes-based projects and this distinction perhaps between evaluating the intervention versus evaluating the social impact bond.
Yep. I think just to reiterate what Mark just said, they are always, to me, approaching the evaluations of any outcomes-based projects, of which SIB is a particular type. There are three issues that always pop up that are relevant to these kinds of approaches. One is outcomes risks, which is this the right intervention for achieving the outcomes? Are you targeting the right groups? Will the outcomes shift for those groups? Just because this intervention works for group A doesn't always mean it works for group B. The second issue is implementation risk. Just because something has been shown to work somewhere else, have you implemented it properly enough in your local context so that you reduce the risk of it not working? Or is there consistency in the way you approach things or deliver things? So we often call an intervention by a name, like cognitive behavioral therapy. But actually, there's so many different models of CBTs. And I know in the Life Chances Fund pipeline now in the UK, there's a whole series of projects around social prescribing. But what are we talking about when we say social prescribing? They look really, really different from area to area. So there's the outcomes risk, implementation risk. The third is value for money. So these three will never go away. So when you're doing any kind of evaluation, especially of outcomes-based projects and contracts, they must always have these three components. But as Claire was saying, depending on your specific learning needs, the priorities in relation to one another might be different. But cross-cutting all of those three dimensions is the additional question, not just about are the outcomes being met, is it being implemented well? You also need to cross-cut all those three domains with the added question of, so what is the SIB effect in influencing the way this is being implemented here, as opposed to the same or similar intervention being implemented elsewhere not with a SIB. So when we did the evaluation of the S6 multisystemic therapy SIB, that was quite good in the sense that it benefited from the fact that multisystemic therapy is a licensed program. It's an evidence-based program. It's a licensed program. So it has to be delivered in a certain way. So immediately we benefited from the fact that some of the implementation variability is narrowed. It's not completely removed, but it's narrowed. So you could then look more at the outcomes. And so we selected the S6 multisystemic therapy, which was commissioned and delivered under a SIB, with other MSTs in the UK that are not commissioned via a SIB. So under conventional fee-for-service or blended mix of grant and fee-for-service. We also had the benefit of comparing that against the international benchmark that came from 17 randomized controlled trials across the world, especially in North America, about the likely levels of effectiveness. And because of that, we were in a slightly better position to be able to say, we think this net effect on balance was probably attributable to the fact that this was done under a SIB and not something else. But, you know, how many other types of interventions actually have the luxury of having those different levels of control that you can build in? So it is always by nature very, very difficult. But qualitatively, that played a role because we would always interview practitioners, managers, commissioners about not just talking about outcomes, but getting them to directly compare, what do you think this might have looked like if it was under a fee-for-service? Would your behaviors have changed, etc., etc.? So trying to get them to come up with their own counterfactual.
That's great, thank you. And I think that raises an important point that there are many different approaches and many more growing approaches to trying to understand some of the attribution type questions. These classic causal impact questions have traditionally been answered via things that look like randomized control trials or very robust quasi-experimental methods. But actually I think there's a growing kind of pragmatism to using different approaches in this space, so drawing on more qualitative methods to that end. Claire, did you want to say a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to underscore that in terms of being able to make attributional claims for what is effectively a managerial approach, right? Like, this is a very new thing for academics and practitioners alike, right? So this is something that the field is reconciling. You can't necessarily randomize a managerial approach. So in terms of your methodology for trying to prove that it's the managerial approach that worked, you're a bit constrained. You got to get creative. And so that's what Chi-Hung did, right? It's around trying to figure out, okay, well, in the absence of being able to micromanage the environment wherein we're going to assign a treatment and control predicated on how you're going to manage them, if you're going to do a SIB or not, you have to start thinking around, you know, what is a fair comparison here? How can I kind of control and constrain as many things as possible? But this isn't a lab. I can't necessarily dose that out. And so, you know, this is where a conversation has to be had, right? It's not about someone having the right answer. It's about trying to discern what the right answer is for your particular project.
Great, thank you. Before we move on to some more of the practical considerations, I was just wondering if, Chi-Hung, perhaps if you had anything more to say in terms of advice around scoping the remit for an evaluation for those people out there who have got a new project that's just coming together.
Sure. I think I'd always start with the point that Claire made about really being clear, what is it you want this to do for you, what learning you want, how you're going to put that to use. So if you have that clarity, then do something that we've all spoken about previously, which is, can you please pull together a logic model to begin with? Don't spend too much time on it, and certainly do it as a collective, because one of the first things you will find is that your colleagues, and I bet money on it, are going to have a different interpretation of what the whole thing looks like and how it hangs together. So do a logic model, and the whole point of that is to bring into surface all the different perspectives about how this is supposed to work, how this is envisaged to work, and then keep it live. You always have to come back to it. Once you've got some kind of a draft logic model, my own practice is always to draw up a very simple table that sets out, okay, so if this is our logic model, what types of data do we need from which part of the logic model? Because it helps to answer what types of questions we have. Is it going to be qualitative? Is it going to be quantitative? It's also asking you about what of this data do you already have, or do some of your partners already have? It asks you which groups do you need what types of information for, so you don't overburden people. It then makes you clarify, if you're getting this kind of information from this group, what is the most appropriate means? What's the most appropriate method of doing that? So in a very simple table, you can actually clarify a lot of things, such as, how do you make the most effective use of what you already have? Because people keep collecting evidence when actually the system has so much evidence, we're just not using it well enough. The other thing, which is the flip side of that, is we often make assumptions that just because a system has the evidence, you can pull it out very easily. Not necessarily so. There are lots of informational governance requirements, data sharing requirements, so factor in more time. It'll also make it very clear to you how much and what types of new data you need. And that immediately starts to clarify, therefore, what likely resource and time implications this has. It might then make you go back and say, well, this is our wish list of objectives, but having seen this emerging table, we're not going to get all of this. So what's the real priority here? So I think the key thing from doing that scoping in a simple tabular manner is it manages everyone's expectations about what you can realistically achieve and what you can do with what you have the money to achieve.
Great, some really pragmatic tips in there. Thank you, Chi-Hung. We've had a couple of questions come in from the audience around thinking about the cost and the work involved in conducting an evaluation. So one question is around, when is it cost effective to conduct an evaluation, and when shouldn't evaluation be done? Also, a question about, should we measure outcomes or impacts that may not be in our control? Chi-Hung, perhaps you could kick us off on those.
Sure. To me, who used to wear a hat as an evaluator, I still evaluate, but I do a lot of other things. I always say you have to have evaluation, because if you're serious about improving public services, there must always be a component of evaluation. Good commissioning is not an event. Good commissioning is a process, and evaluation is part of that process. So to me, there's always a compelling case for evaluation. As to how much you spend on it, I think that's a different issue. And I think that's why what I was saying earlier about how do you scope up the remit of the evaluation would give you a clearer basis about determining how much something is going to cost, and therefore how much money you can spend, what you can get for the money you spend. So you can almost do that, internal cost and benefit assessment in your mind about what's the added cost to get that additional answer to a question that you might have. But do clarify it, because even your colleagues may not share the same assumption around that. And as to wider unanticipated impacts, I think there's a difference between measuring them and detecting them. I think it's always important to detect. That doesn't mean you always then move on to measure. So for those of us who are familiar with the Magenta book in the UK, which gives guidance on how to do evaluations, it does say good evaluation means looking out for even unintended consequences. So you might think this intervention does good, but actually, are you really confident it doesn't do some harm unwittingly? So casting the net wide, just asking very simple questions like, are there anything else that you think is happening that I may not have asked you about, that have not been defined as an outcome that we're measuring in this project? So just to give you an example, for the S6 evaluation, in the first year of the evaluation, through the interviews, we started to hear things like, oh, and we're having to do some extra stuff around this. So we heard that from both the commissioners, the providers, and the investors. So when we looked across the data, we sat down with government and said, actually, we've detected something here that we term indirect costs. So over and above the financial cost of your SIB, if people are starting to talk about, we're doing all these extra things that we didn't think of before, these are unanticipated. They didn't see it. It wasn't properly resourced. It's all under the radar. So we detected it, we surfaced it, we had a steering group discussion with all the players about, this is what we detected. Do we think it's important to go on and measure it? Because just because you detect something doesn't mean that you necessarily have to measure it. In that case, everyone agreed that we should actually go on to measure it, to quantify it, put a figure on it, so that we can design that out of the SIB, so that the SIB becomes more efficient in coming years. So, back to my point, it's important to detect. You may not always necessarily need to move on to measurement.
That's really helpful, thank you. And Mark, I was wondering whether you had any reflections on some of these challenges around measuring outcomes within complex systems and focusing on outcomes when they may not always be within complete control, particularly of a local authority.
I'd echo what Ji-Hung said. I think it seems essential to me that you're cited on the consequences, intended and unintended consequences, but also understanding what's driving those consequences, both intentional drivers, the new intervention that you put in place, but maybe some unintended drivers, which may be having a either positive or negative impact on the evaluation. It seems critical. I think it raises a second question for me about who the audience might be for the evaluation. And if that audience is just local, then you might spend less time on some of those things, some of those more external factors. So you might want an evaluation that generates recommendations that are then within the gift and the scope of the audience for that evaluation. But personally speaking, I wouldn't want to stop it there. So I would say that there might be a primary audience, but there are then opportunities to influence other people's approaches, other thinking, and either in parallel sites, parallel places, which are thinking about some of these similar things, and a clear, more clarity for other places who are thinking about implementing an approach that's been tried in one place. It's valuable for them to know about the variety of causes of effects. There may be some institutions that you could influence and lobby and advocate for policy change to give greater chances of success to new approaches as well. So I would be keen personally to sort of look at both the intended and unintended consequences, but also the intended and unintended drivers of those changes.
Thank you. We're now moving on to a section focused on some more of the practical considerations around evaluation in the context of outcomes-based commissioning. We've had a couple of questions come in around the cost of evaluation work and use of data. I think as a panel, we're clearly all quite pragmatic. I think people will hopefully sense our willingness to kind of move with what's appropriate and what really fits locally. So I think we come with that in mind. So Ji-Hung, perhaps I could ask you to give a sense of the practicalities of commissioning and resourcing an evaluation.
Sure. I think especially in relation to SIBs, there are a number of considerations that set SIB evaluation slightly apart from other types of public service or public policy evaluation. So the issue of who should or should not be the evaluator is very important. So in many other parts of public services, there is a growing practice of, say, project self-evaluating. And in fact, people are building capacity for ground level operational staff to be better on top of evidence on impact. There are also lots of examples of the commissioners themselves having some internal capacity to do evaluations of things they commission. But when it comes to a SIB, the SIB evaluator and the independence of that evaluator is really, really important. I think it's fair to say when it comes to SIBs, there are heightened levels of anxieties because there's this other pot of money that comes with a financial return attached to it. And public service accountability is very important in terms of spending that money. So if you're not careful, you might end up with people thinking that your evaluation might have been biased or steered by commercial interests or in central government interest in really wanting this to continue feeding a central government policy initiative that actually local areas might not necessarily take to. So the independence of the evaluator is really, really important. So they must not be directly involved in things like delivery of the intervention and or the performance management, because the performance management has a critical impact on outcomes trigger payments. So anything to do with the direct financial flow within that model, it's just as well that the evaluators are not involved in any aspect of that. So independence, conflicts of interest, very, very important. The normal way of then going out to commission for evaluation, I think lots of public sector bodies are very familiar with that, about what should go into the specification, the different types of information headings, what you should set out clearly to prospective contractors. One thing that I always encourage people to consider when it comes to evaluations of SIBs is coming back to what's the purpose of that evaluation. You should then actually have a creative discussion about who should pay for that evaluation. So it's not always the commissioners or the outcome payers who pay for evaluations. So in the UK, for instance, we do have SIB evaluations that are paid for by social investors. And if that's so, what's the type of governance around an evaluation that has to be independent but might be funded by a social investor? There are other SIB evaluations that are funded by central government, when actually the outcome payer might be local authorities or clinical commissioning groups, etc. There are co-funded evaluations between a local authority and central government or in some other configurations. So do think creatively about who is going to pay for the evaluation, because actually what's the purpose of that evaluation?
Great, thank you. Yes, it's not a terribly large space, so I think clarity around potential conflicts of interest, transparency over independence in terms of who's paying for the research and who's benefiting from that research, I think is a really important point in this space. We've had some questions come through in terms of the scale and the form of evaluation that might be required. Are there any other things that local authorities, or on what basis do you work through at what point to bring in an evaluation team, Mark, and the scale of ambition attached to a particular evaluation?
I think it's, there's some helpful indicators of proportion of project size, budget that you might allocate towards evaluation. I think Chi-Hung mentioned there's some treasury guidance on some of this in the UK, which is helpful. I think taken too blindly, you could end up sort of with the sort of one pager that Chi-Hung referenced, where you've got return on investment in paragraph 1, cost benefit analysis on paragraph 2, I'm going to spend 7% of the project budget on evaluation and then come back. I think actually spending the time to work out what are the questions that you want to answer and at what stage do you need or want them to be answered is really important. And there will be a combination of relatively closed questions. Did this program or is this program delivering the changes that we expect it to? there'll be some more open questions as well about, well, what does this tell us about how we might adopt or adjust mainstream spending accordingly. So I think time spent perhaps steered by some of those thresholds of spending to give a bit of a sense of sensible amounts of money to spend on evaluation is helpful. But for me, the real benefit is then thinking through, well, what are the sorts of questions that we want to answer? And the amount of time and the amount of, you asked a question about when in the process to ask these sorts of questions. It seems to me that it's probably a case of the earlier the better. And although you might not start the evaluation activities right at the start of a program or a project, I think being clear as early as possible about what you're trying to address, the theory of change, and that an evaluation might help you better understand, the earlier you're asking yourself those sorts of questions, and the better for the project and ultimately the evaluation itself.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple of questions come in around data. A question from James also in relation to the use of new technologies and whether that creates new opportunities for collecting data and so on. Claire, with your background in tech and evaluation, this definitely seems like a question for you. Could you talk us a little bit about data and what we might be thinking about on data and evaluation work?
Sure. So I really like the suggestion from Chi-Hung earlier, right? That in addition to mapping out your theory of change or logic model, you might also map out the various data sources that you would use in each of those particular buckets or phases of your theory of change. So I think the first step is probably taking an inventory, right? And actually just think through, well, what are we working with? What do we already do? And I think the exercise of taking that inventory is that you can start then making explicit the trade-offs of maybe collecting new information where you don't have anything, vis-a-vis going with something that is perhaps already existing, but maybe not ideal. And so the way in which data access and availability actually can have a pretty determining effect on the scope for that evaluation, depending upon how much you're willing to resource primary data collection, so a bespoke data collection effort for your particular evaluation, versus relying on existing resources. In terms of how this intersects perhaps with advances in technology, I guess a couple of things, right? So it has become less expensive to both collect and store information. And with that, often organizations have an abundance of data that they capture automatically, but it's stored in a way that makes it very difficult to access and share. And it's those sort of complexities of data warehousing that often get in the way of actually using information meaningfully, both for evaluation, but also for decision making. So that inventory is a key step because it sort of brings to the surface the kinds of complexities that happen once you're actually trying to extract information and potentially give it to someone external to your organization. That said, administering a survey is not as burdensome as it used to be, right? Having things automatically capture in referral sheets, having a centralized intake form, these are all things that you can set up at relatively low cost. And depending on your IT infrastructure, you can roll out with relative ease internally, but also conceivably to your provider organizations. So I do think that the sort of financial barriers have come down, but you do have to resource an implementation for a new tech rollout. You do have to ensure that the data capture, especially for evaluation, is set up quite early. So to Mark's point of thinking through these things quite early, that also applies to any data collection efforts. Because what you don't want to do is go live with something, have an evaluator come in and then not have the information that they need to be able to deliver for those promises. So there's a lot of opportunity. Things will continue to change quite rapidly in terms of technology available to governments and provider organizations, but it has to be implemented thoughtfully and it needs to be implemented early.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts on that data collection and usage piece?
I think back at Base, at Traverse, we do a lot of evaluations where we really shine a light on lived experiences. And that can be quite difficult to collect if you're talking about wider impact and not just the outcomes that are set by the policy. And so new technologies have to do with better real-time information collecting, especially around lived experience, but also in terms of the implementation from the professional perspective. So there are lots of apps out there where you can collect these sorts of informations. And I know in the UK, especially in NHS, our Department of Health and Social Care here is very keen that we all start using all sorts of health apps for live data, interactive data, and that's all fine, but just always consider the complex system in which you are implementing those apps or technologies. They're not always desirable, even if they are practical. So the technology, you have to make sense of that in the context within which it's being implemented. But I'm very excited. Recently, I'm trying to work up something around, and this is a whisper coming from North America, and I can understand that because of the types of SIBs that the US tend to have, which are the SIBs in the US are slightly different in emphasis from the UK SIBs, in that they are almost wholly used to back proven interventions, and they want to back proven interventions at scale. So certainly in the North American context, there's now this emerging debate about blockchain technology, because there's a cost to data collection in SIBs. So how might blockchain technology actually reduce some of this cost and make it more live, and also align to some of the North American aspirations to turn SIBs into an actual financial instrument, which is not what we in the UK have aspirations for, at least currently. So I've been playing with that idea and really critiquing it, because I think it has real potential if you're using SIBs for certain types of interventions in certain contexts, but it also has real limitations, especially in the way that UK and Western European SIBs are currently being designed and implemented.
Yeah, I guess I would just piggyback off that if I could. I think it's a really good point, right? So when we think through the ability of tech to improve delivery, it's often back office functions that we're talking about, right? It's administrative stuff that you can easily or somewhat easily automate. For SIBs, particularly with vulnerable populations, technology is not a panacea, and it requires a certain amount of person-to-person legwork that it's unfair to expect tech to fix. It's unfair of us to look to that as a solution automatically, I think.
Great, thank you. Just one other thing to potentially chip in on that data piece, coming through from some conversations that I've had, where for some of the early social impact bond projects, the data related to those people who've been receiving the SIB service itself was absolutely fabulous. You had a really great sense of those people's engagement with the project and their long-term outcomes. But at the end of the day, they wanted to conduct an impact evaluation using a quantitative approach, and the data for the relevant comparator group was just not available. So I think if you do have those questions around impact evaluation and you are looking to more conventional forms of quantitative methods in that space, it's always so important to have an awareness not only of the data that you've got at your fingertips relating to your social impact bond project and the people participating in that, but also who is your relevant comparator group, and do you have access on the same data items in the same way? That's such a frustrating situation to be in, to have such a beautiful set of data in many ways, but that's falls at the final hurdle, if you like, in terms of its usability for some really strong evaluation work.
Actually, we've seen that in some of the business cases that we've been developing in Sheffield. So I think the work has shone a light on some of the data quality issues that we have. And to Claire's point, we're going to need to get creative in some of the evaluation approaches, constructing retrospective baselines from retrospective experience to sort of construct some type of counterfactual against which we can see whether or not outcomes are being delivered. And I think also the work that we're doing is explicitly looking at those interventions that require multiple parts of the public sector system to come together. And we're using this as an opportunity, as a hook, if you like, to accelerate some of the conversations about information sharing across different agencies, which will be valuable for this work, but will have so much value in other areas of delivery. I think there is a danger of agonizing about poor data quality and sort of the requirement for gold standard evaluation and agonize too much about that, and you'd say, well, we're just not going to do it. And the cartoon that you flashed up earlier on, kind of, I need to stop helping people because you're messing up my impact assessment. There is a danger of sort of doing the wrong thing or not getting something up and running because of data quality issues or an inability to construct that sort of gold standard level of evaluation. My view would be that's not the right thing to do. We sort of got to find creative ways through some of these areas of uncertainty and ambiguity.
Great. No, I think that's a really important message. Don't let the perfect be the ruiner of the good enough or the learning of today. I think that's a really important one. And also to see this as a, this is a long-term learning opportunity. Actually, social impact bonds and outcomes-based approaches are still, very emergent. And I think everyone's quite humble about the fact that, we're all very much learning in this space and it's doing the best that we can with what's at our fingertips right now. I wanted to move on perhaps to some of the relational questions around managing an evaluation piece. So Chi-Hung, I know that you've been involved on both sides in terms of the advice and engagement work and delivering evaluations as well. Could you talk a little bit about the collaboration between evaluators and project stakeholders?
Sure. Very happy to do that, because anyone who knows me knows I keep banging on about the relational. Because I think it's fair to say in the early years, everyone treats SIP, whether they're design, implementation, or evaluation, as this difficult, complex technical exercise. Yes, there are technical elements, but if that's all you look at, it will flop. You have to pay attention to the relational. The success of outcomes-based contracts, especially SIPs, are deeply relational. And hence the evaluators really need to pay attention to that. Your role isn't just there to get data, analyze it, report it. If you can't negotiate the different levels of relationships, the politics of the small p, this is not going to work. So a number of things from my practice that I would share is you really have to make all the different players really accept the fact that you're not there to judge them and never assume that they know that. I've mentioned this earlier. The other thing is that never assume people understand why you're doing certain methods. So never just go in and say, the evaluation involves doing this. That is just you giving people a list of your methods and the methodological design. You really need to help people understand, why are we doing things like that? Why am I interviewing you? What is this for? Because people won't understand and they might be resistant and therefore not participate in an interview. So you have to explain the rationale for your different methods. You also need to have a very clear analysis plan that you share, because it really manages expectations about what are you wanting from me? How are you going to use the information I'm giving you? It all helps to reassure people, because ultimately your role as evaluator is about keeping a very clear audit trail of all the steps in the technical evaluation procedure, but also of the decisions. And there will be difficult decisions. Not all those decisions are technical decisions. Sometimes it's pragmatic, sometimes it's for emphasis, sometimes it's because a particular player is particularly important and influential. So you do need that audit trail to show and be accountable for how did you get to the conclusions that you publish later. The other thing I would advise you to be clear about is, who are the real gatekeepers here? And gatekeepers in terms of access, not just to existing data, but also access to people. There are people you will need to speak to, but there are important gatekeepers to go through to have access to those people you need to speak to. So who are these people? How do you get them on board? Even if those gatekeepers aren't actually people you interview. So there are all these other people around the evaluation that play critical roles in making it a success. You need to have very upfront and ongoing conversations about it's about Mark's point about, you have a need for answers to certain questions. When do you need what types of answers by, what are good enough answers in the interim, and what are the most appropriate ways of packaging those answers. Because everyone in the field needs the evidence, but no one has the time to read wordy reports. So think creatively about the format, the timeliness. Could you do an infographic that really conveys the learning, the findings? To me, as an evaluator, I assess the quality of our work, not just in the technical robustness, but it's in the usefulness and usability. So those two are always big criteria for me: how useful and how usable. And that comes down to those discussions about when and how, what types of format. You also need to have very upfront discussions about every time an output is being produced, a draft output is circulated for comments, what is the process for soliciting feedback? Because you do not want decision by committee. And I can assure you, everyone will have something to say when they see a first output. So you'll be pulled in every which direction. So have those conversations up front about what is the due process for that. Have a very early conversation about getting everyone to commit to putting things in the public domain. I think those of us who work in the SIB field are always lamenting the fact that although we all say evidence is so important, a lot of it is not out in the public domain, you know, either because of commercial interest or whatever. But I think unless we prove or answer the question that SIBs really are a better way of doing things in these contexts, unless we can have a clear answer to that, we are never going to overcome the resistance and barrier. So getting that commitment to sharing the learning, putting things in public domain, and then having a sensible ongoing dissemination strategy to show people not just what you're finding, but also to show people what's the added value of the evaluation. So it's not just about this is what we found. It's also about this is what we've then used it for. That keeps the evaluation alive. That keeps the narrative about the usefulness of evaluation alive.
Fantastic. What an emphatic line on which to begin to wrap this up. Thank you so much. A big plea there to share findings, share learning in this space. I think that's really powerful. Thank you. We would really appreciate your feedback on the session that we've been hosting today. So we have a Slido tool that can take your comments and feedback. So please do take a minute to give us some feedback on how you found the session today. We're always looking to improve our webinars and think about the resources that we'll put together in future. I just wanted to flag a few extra resources. We've recently put together and revised an evaluation how-to guide, which is on our website, but we also think it's valuable to look at other key resources in this space. So in the UK, the Treasury's Magenta book is really the handbook. This is the Bible for evaluation practice in this space from a UK government perspective. There's also detailed guidance around impact evaluation that's backed by the UN and the World Bank, and other guides and tools are also available in the knowledge section of the Government Outcomes Lab websites. We would be we'd also like to point out a useful interactive toolkit on the Better Evaluation website. So particularly where you're not comfortable necessarily in identifying the methods that best map onto the types of questions you have, or the type of approach that you might like to take to evaluation, there's a really useful tool that can work through from the types of questions you have to think about what might be an appropriate lens to take or an appropriate methodology to adopt in that space. So thank you everyone for joining us again today. I just wondered whether anyone had any kind of final remarks to wrap things up with.
I think for me, it's just to underscore the idea that this is about learning, right? And that's how you create buy-in amongst folks. So it's not a competition. It's not it's not anything negative. It's about experimenting and having the freedom to try different stuff, and a system for knowing whether or not that stuff works, right? It should feel like a low stakes learning environment. It should feel empowering. It shouldn't feel onerous.
Great, thank you.
I think Ji Hong's point from earlier on about is this optional? Is this something that we should or shouldn't do? It feels like it's an essential part of the commissioning process. So I think it's not a valid question to ask whether or not we should be doing evaluation. It's an essential part of the process. But I think then they get some interesting and challenging questions about how you design these sorts of things and balance different considerations and balance the amount you spend on an evaluation versus mainstream delivery. But I think there are some useful tools that you just signposted that can help answer some of those things. I think the thing that Claire said earlier about getting creative, for me, I think we've got to get creative in how we evaluate, given the infancy of this model, given some of the uncertainties, some of the ambiguities, so that over time those uncertainties and ambiguities can become a little bit less. But it's exciting.
Great, thank you. Ji-Hung?
For me, it's about don't treat the evaluation aspect as being fixed from the start. I'm a big fan of what Claire said. It's a learning thing, and you never know in advance what you need to learn until you get going. So the Essex SIB, for instance, started with very clear evaluation questions, but as it went on, we kept revising some of the questions and some of the objectives to really help the SIB run more fluidly, effectively, because SIBs don't exist to be evaluated. SIBs exist to improve outcomes. Surely that's the whole point of it. So at various points, we included different questions, such as the Essex SIB ran into trouble because the referrals just weren't coming in. So why weren't they coming in? How could we actually encourage better referral? So we changed tack and really shone a light on that. You heard me talk earlier about hearing things from what people say, and then in year 2 going, actually we think there are these indirect costs, and actually we should design these out. And so the evaluation objectives change. So the evaluation can start with a certain level of certainty, but let it breathe, because it has to be useful and usable.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So a flexible, collaborative, shared learning project, definitely something I think we're all part of here. Thank you again for joining us, and do let us know if you have any questions or feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you.